All right, welcome to the copy session number 4, Green Defects. Tim and I, where's Tim gone? Have been arranging these sessions with the kind hospitality of the ICO and with the ICO. Vicente is here recording, and we'll be putting this up online later on. What we have got for you in front of you are 5 little cups containing your defect samples. You can drink them now, but there won't be any left for later, so don't drink them now. They're in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from left to right, and some seats don't have a desk in front of them. So if you have a double row in front of you, the second row will be for someone who is not sat at a desk. So it'll be probably someone behind you in the seats. Make sure that you have identified a set of samples that will be yours, so you don't start drinking someone else's. Everyone happy? Got samples in front of them? Got all 5? Anyone not? Hands up. All good. Okay, so 2 speakers tonight. Marianne from Master Roast is a green buyer and will be talking you through how defects occur and what the defects are. Then a break. Then you have Javier from Flavor Active who will talk you through the defect real flavour, simulated real flavour. And by the end of tonight you should understand a lot more about how defects occur and how they taste. There is a Q&A at the end. I should say a quick thanks to the ICO, but also a thanks to Caffeine. So hands up who's going to Caffeine after this?
For a beer.
Yeah, okay. They do a great job in staying open, organising all the food, organising the beer, and they do it as a favour. So if you have time to thank them when you go in there tonight, I'm sure they would appreciate it. With that said, I'm going to introduce you to Marianne. Here she goes.
Evening. It was a bit too early, but evening anyway. This talk then, what I'm focusing on is green bean defects, in particular the origination of some of those, but how we associate them currently with some of the calibrations that we have across the coffee industry with tastes, flavours and aromas, but in particular off tastes, flavours and aromas. So the agenda basically is to look at the industry standards that we currently have. Industry standards to me are global standards, and generally speaking they're formalised in some manner. So for that it means that I'm looking at particular origins, and I'm also going to look then back to the SCAA, which have clear definitions in certain cases on what defects are as a visual and also as a non-visual, but also potentially what they're going to taste like and what type of flavours we can associate with them. And then navigating defects. From that, it should kind of become pretty apparent, and probably from our day-to-day experiences with defects, if we do come across them. If we're not fortunate enough to come across them, then great, but if we do come across them, it's going to become clear that it's not enough just to look at them visually, but we also need to be able to assess them in the cup. So some form of tasting has to go on, and some form of understanding of what we're tasting to describe them and better understand them. And then finally, defects as a perception, more to do with how we perceive things individually and how that can sometimes be problematic. Because you might have a defect before you, and it might be described as a defect, but do you recognise it as that first of all? And then how do you go on to describe it potentially in your flavours, odours and tastes? And for that, do not worry, I'm only going to focus on one particular one that causes a lot of issues across the board. So green bean defects, for me, this pretty good quote, if you're just talking about green bean defects as your starting point, is the idea that anything that diverges from the norm, basically, in the bean lots. So it's something that can be produced in the field, it can be during the harvest, it can be during processing, transport or storage. So it can become pretty problematic at all stages, but primarily we usually associate it with origin, but it can become problematic with the ways in which we store coffee in our own facilities, and also how we transport coffee. So when I was saying earlier about standardisation of grading, I'm particularly talking about standardisation of visual grading, but I'm also partially talking about how we standardise our cupping assessment, and it's the congregating of those two things which gives us an assessment of the quality of the coffee, which is ultimately what we're all concerned about, the quality of the coffee. So origin dependent, by that I mean we have grading systems that not only talk about the screen sizing, tolerances, we're talking about the odour acceptability, the visual, the colouring, we're also talking about altitude, but we're also talking about tolerances on defects for every single origin. and they're almost legal standards that are regulated by different groups and different bodies. And within them, the defect standards vary. Without going into too much depth, looking at Ethiopia's defect standard for, say, a grade 1 visual or in a taste circumstances would be slightly foolish to then compare it with Guatemala's standard for an SHB being exported. They are different and they're not universal. Then when you come to the internal and export market, by that what I mean is you've got an internal market and you've got a grading system there where we're also talking about defects and we're appropriating language to defects again. But that's not necessarily the same as your export market and the grades which you then receive there, because they're also going to be different to your internal market. So what I mean by that is just we're trying to just navigate that we're all talking about one thing, but we're potentially describing it slightly differently, and then what we end up with impacting our quality when we buy it and we export it in can be very different to what someone is discussing back at origin, because we're not talking about the same grades essentially. And then finally, very minor in this is the terminal markets. Be aware that also the commodity exchanges have their own grading systems for quality in the cup, but also they have a different grading system, quality for the visual defects and the type of defects. So in conclusion of that part then, it's always looking at a cupping assessment and a visual assessment. And if you were going to do a visual assessment and just congregate some of the things that people are talking about, it's a bit mind-boggling because there are lots. They're associated with lots of different things. And there are some things that we never see probably or mention. Crystal beans, we probably hear about full black beans, full sours and so on, but there are probably a lot of things that we don't come across that are within people's internal and actual export grading systems. So be aware. But also that they're visual defects, and at this point we're not even necessarily associating a particular taste taint to them. The one that we're probably more aware of from a visual perspective is the SCA grading form, so the Grading Green Arabica Coffee Classification. And probably the best example where there's not only a methodology, so you're given a set amount of coffee that you're supposed to evaluate, but you're also told what type of defects you're supposed to identify. And it's quite clear and quite stringent, and then you're given a tolerance for those type of defects. That's the current stage that we're at. And so for their understanding of a green graded specialty coffee, it's supposed to be free from all primary defects. And if you ever do read that book and look at the pictures, it clearly states what they are. So there's a clear methodology that we have for these guys and a protocol as well, and they would like to associate themselves with a specialty standard. So again, you cannot use that universally to associate it with the grades that you bought at an export market or an export quality grade. It's different, but there are some things that are associated with those markets, in particular with the defects that we would classify as primary types of visual defects. Okay, so from saying all of that and then showing you all of this, it would suggest that we haven't got people working very hard to produce clean coffee. We obviously have. We've got very advanced machinery and sorters, colour sorters, and then we've got extensive work that people are doing at different levels with different qualities that you're buying. You could all buy a Guatemala SHB, but the point of difference must be not just about the visual defects. We're talking about the quality in the cup, which means we have to look at it beyond just a visual grading of defects. So if I move on further from that then, where do we find some sort of calibration for what we might expect in the cup? In particular, when we're talking about taints and we're talking about off flavours and off odours. The SCA Cupping Handbook gives us some kind of understanding of what you might experience, but it doesn't necessarily associate it particularly back to where it originates from. So it breaks things down. It tells you, for example, you can look at hidiness and think that you're going to end up with leatheriness as the particular type of taint that you're going to have. Or you could talk about woodiness and you can talk about ferment, and you can say this is what you're going to expect in the cup. That's all fine because it's a way that we can navigate with particular language that we can appropriate to something that's descriptive as either a flavour or a taste or an odour. But if you've never experienced it, that's potentially when it becomes problematic. And how do you personally assess it as being severe or being something that could equate to, in your circumstances, if you're in quality control, some of you, or if you're buyers, or at the end you're complaining about a coffee, whether or not it's something that should be rejected, for example. Then coming back then to cupping forms, again I'm using as a reference SCA cupping form and deliberately the cup of excellence, because I'm starting to now navigate and look at types of language people are using to associate with defects and negative off taints and flavours to see what we currently have and how people are describing things. If you're just going to look at the SCAA methodology and you look at what a defect is, then under defects for them, it's merely just a taint. It's noticeable, but it's not necessarily severe, and it's usually associated with something we can smell, olfactory. It's an aromatic potentially, but it doesn't tell you what that could be. If it's a fault, then it's something that's overwhelming. And then they say, for example, this overwhelming fault could be a ferment, it could be phenolic, it could be sour or rubbery. So you've got a mixture of things that you might think are associated to tastes, they're associated to flavours. But again, you might never have experienced these things, so how do we place them? If you go right to the end of it and you look at their whole protocol, cleanliness also says non-coffee-like tastes. So we're presuming that we're going to know what a non-like coffee taste is going to be if we're using this type of cupping form, which is what we currently have out there and a lot of people do use to grade their coffees. Cup of Excellence, probably why I'm deliberately referencing this type of form, is because it's a lot more exact in what it's trying to say at the very least, and trying to help us to say what a defect is, or what a flavour taint is, or what an aftertaste taint is, and what cleanliness is. Actually goes into detail to say directly what a defect is. It's phenolic, it's ferment, it's oniony, it's Rio, it's sweaty, it's Rialdo, it's problematic, it's big. There's no acceptance. You need to be able to find it. So it's clear to us in that sense. And then we have flavours. So these might be grassy, woody, baggy. And then we have aftertaste, metallic. And then we have cleanliness. Again, interesting because it also references earthy, mouldy, dirty, off, fruity. So here we have a far easier kind of language system for us that is descriptively associated with problematic things that come up and affect ultimately the quality of coffee. So we can probably work a lot better off that. How might that look though? If I go back to what I was saying about a non-visual defect and then what we should expect in the taste for this coffee or the flavour taint, then it can also look a bit confusing, because if you look and you take the SCAA's grading form, the green coffee grading book, and you look at what it says a full black bean is, it clearly tells you what it visually should look like. But then it says it could be soury in taste, it could have stinker-like flavours, it could be ferment in taste, it could be medicinal, it could be earthy, and it could be mouldy. So it could be lots of different things. So what I'm trying to conclude from this is it's very hard and probably not best suggested that you merely look at a visual defect and say, this is what I'm going to experience in the cup, and this is how it's going to taste, and what the flavours are going to be like, and what the outcome is going to be. It's far better that you have that as your separate assessment, and then you actually assess what you find in the cup. And you penalise the coffee if you want to, and hopefully we will if there are problems in it, in a separate manner to how you visually assess the coffee, because they do not necessarily always merge together, and they can be problematic. So how might this look? Okay, I've deconstructed partly the SCA cupping form. I hope we're all aware of this, we might not be, but it just gives you an idea that if you were going to navigate it currently, how it might look, and why having issues in your coffee doesn't necessarily mean that you penalise your coffee the whole way through. So you might have something in fragrance and aroma, for example, presume that we can perceive it and we find it problematic, and you say, for example, it's cardboardy, it's sweaty, it's these things. But then when you come to the flavour descriptor, you might not necessarily full on describe it as all of those things. You might not find it completely problematic. You may do, probably will do, but you might not do. So you're not necessarily going to have a link between the two there, okay? And it's the same with aftertaste. So kind of getting to synergy and moving that forward to uniformity and clean cup, it's not always a given when you're presented with a defectious cup or something that's problematic in the cup from a quality perspective, that you're going to end up with a cup that is definitely not uniform and not a clean cup. It's not always a given, and also vice versa. So these things don't necessarily always have synergy when we come to assess them. And it's also the same for a quantitative kind of analysis of this. If you are not aware of what the fault or the taint is, going back to the SCA cupping form, then how are you able to say yes or no you find it? So you could have a scenario where you're finding descriptive terms and you're qualitatively scoring it on your form, but you're not actually able to say, yes, this was a taint, or yes, this was a fault. And you're not able then to describe what the fault was. So on paper, it looks great, but if we're not exposed to these things and we're not aware of them, it's not going to be a given that we're always going to be able to combine everything together and say dramatically, this is what's wrong with the cup and why there's a problem with quality, and this is what particularly I have a problem with. For example, mould. And we'll discuss that a bit later. So in conclusion of that, in very brief conclusion, we need to recognise we've got different grading systems. They're different grading systems all around the world, and they're based not only on what you experience in the cup quality, but also visually. It's definitely an evaluation that's both sensorial and visual, and usually these come together to conclude the type of coffee that you're going to get and the type of quality, and ultimately what you're buying, and hopefully that kind of merges up with what you're experiencing in the cup as well, back in your facilities. At the end of it, it's all about quality. It's quality impact, which is why these things are so problematic. They impact and impart on the quality in some way. We're not sure yet on the scale or the impact or how severe it is, because that's dependent on who's interpreting it, but they do have a problem, which is why we all recognise them globally. But while we're all here, there's no universal calibration for defect aromas, flavours and odours at this moment. There is an understanding that there is something problematic out there, but we haven't yet universally come together to say this is ultimately what we should look at and focus on, and this is how we can do it, so all of us are aware of it, and then we can always pick it up in the cup. And definitely what I get to at the end of that, it's subjective and it's open to interpretation, which become very problematic. So very briefly, I'm just going to go into a few areas where these may occur. Field damage then, when I say green defects, I actually mean things that are happening either at the cherry stage or in the green bean stage. We're not talking yet at the roasted stage, but I do give an example of what they might taste like or how they might come up as an aroma once you've roasted them and once you then experience them in a brewed beverage. So you've got everything. There's a few areas here. Genetics, diseases, pests, climatic, mineral deficiency might be the main things that you will see or hear people talking about as being problematic for when these defects occur. So there's a few things you're going to see on here. You can't necessarily always see these things, which links back to what I was kind of saying earlier. So I won't go through all of them, but what I am going to pick up is that we start to see a correlation with particular characteristics that seem to pop up in flavour traits from the research that's out there and from experience of cupping them, and also aromatic taints. Okay, so they can be lots of these that are to do with climatic deficiencies. For example, the withered bean, it's usually due to drought, lack of water is the primary concern about that, and it can lead on to what you experience in the cup. If you collate a lot of them, which it's always fun to do, or not as the case may be, it can taste pretty grassy if you get them all together, and pretty unpleasant and straw-like as an aroma that you might associate with it. And then you have things on here such as amber bean that a lot of us might not come across necessarily visually as a defect or even recognise, but actually in the cup when you isolate it and you assess it, again it can have woody aromatic characteristics and it can have grassiness in particular as a flavour, but also prevalent in the aftertaste. So all of these can pick up and give us problematic issues, and the reason all of these are chosen is because a lot of people would agree universally that they're pretty severe. They're not minor. They would be classified, generally speaking, a lot of those as primary defects in a grading system at origin. Diseases, only briefly going to look at this as a snapshot, because some of these don't necessarily lead on to having a defect as such or something that's problematic that you can associate back to it, but due to what they do to the coffee plant and potentially the coffee cherry, they can basically break down the capability of the plant to carry out the basic practices, basically photosynthesis, and be able to produce a mature, developed cherry. So it has an adverse effect there, which is partly linked back to some of these, like leaf rust or the anthracnosic diseases that you see, the fungal diseases that affect both the cherry and the tree. Then processing related, we might put in this categorization machinery, the type of machinery used, quality of machinery in particular, picking, at what point we're picking, how ripe the coffee or the cherry is that we're picking, fermentation, timing of fermentation, sanitation as well, a key area across all of those, drying, and what I mean by intermediate stages is intermediate stages by how long we leave something, in particular the red cherry itself. So a lot of these you might start to hear about now because potato cup gets a lot of negative press, but probably why? Because it definitely tastes like potato and has a very strong aromatic of potato, but it's actually affiliated primarily to the anesthesia bug, which is in turn due to what it does to the actual coffee cherry, scraping it heightens the risk of fungal damage and bacterial infection. Similar to insect damage as well, especially with coffee berry borer, which can lead to ultimately loss of aroma, which is why it's so problematic, and loss of particular key flavours and tastes of the coffee, which is why people like to get out severe insect damage, because that's what we know it can lead to. Another one's on here that you might also hear of and definitely see in all coffee grades, but primarily if you're in the top coffee grades, I would probably say you're not going to be experiencing black beans and sour beans, but you might experience them in the cup at some point. Black beans in particular are problematic. These can occur, a lot of these, at multiple different stages. It can be to do with fermentation, it can be to do with picking unripe beans as well, and it can be to do with how you leave your coffee to dry. So please don't just think that they belong to one group. But black beans, we start to get to something interesting, because we're starting to talk about something that can potentially produce in the cup not only rotten fruit-like fruit characteristics that are unpleasant in flavours, but can also be dirty, mouldy and sour. So this is what I was going back to earlier, just merely identifying one thing associated with these defects is problematic. And also some of these in their own right, like mouldiness, might be counted and is counted by some as a defect in its own right. So there is a lot of crossover, and it makes it harder for us to isolate things and better understand them. And cherry picking delays here. When we have the non-visuals, those who have ever experienced a stinker, if you ever have, or never want to experience again, something that you cannot see, but its impact is immense. Impact is immense. It's not only in odour, but in what it does to the overall quality of the coffee, and foul, rotten fish type flavours that you might associate with it, that come originally from basically microorganisms and infection and bacteria breakdown within the coffee cherry. And then we also have areas such as Foxy, which I would use to correlate back to what I was saying earlier, where different origins have different assessments of what a defect is. For some origins, such as Brazil, Foxy beans are not a problematic issue. And a lot of research has been done by people like Terra Estate in particular, where when you have these in smaller volumes within a coffee that is perceived to be clean and you spike it, a lot of people cannot perceive that there's anything problematic. Instead, in fact, in their research, some suggested that there were favourable taste characteristics and descriptors, flavour descriptors they associated with it. But other countries see it as highly problematic. So for Ethiopia, it's going to be a problem in a grade 1 or a grade 2, ultimately, to have a Foxy bean. Processing and fermentation. So a big area, lots of different types of fermentation and ways to remove the mucilage, and lots of different risks that come with this. Fermentation itself, I should just point out, can be perceived by some as an over-ferment in its own right, is a defect, but we also have some that I haven't added on here, such as black beans, that some people would put in this categorization as also being an outcome along with stinkers of fermentation as well. But what you end up with through lack of sanitization and over-fermentation potentially is something like a sour bean that for a lot of us we might physically see, or partial sours. And these can be intensely sour, winey, and usually, when identified, can have a higher concentration for a lot of us as a taste associated with acetic acid. Sanitation and machinery, far lower on the list, but I still think it's worth a mention because it's an important area. But minor things, because these can pop up in your grade 1 coffees where you've got nipped and potential chip damage, and they could lead to, I say could quite leniently, to further issues such as fermented off flavours that are associated with the coffee, but probably far less problematic than the others we've mentioned. And then drying after all the hard work that's gone into it, and say you haven't got a coffee that's problematic, and then you over dry your coffee in your mechanical dryers, or you don't appropriately turn your coffee, and then it leads to unpleasant characteristics. In particular, what I would say over dried coffee, that has been an association as a problem historically with places like Honduras, and sometimes can be found in Brazilian coffees because of the nature of the type of drying that they do. The over-dried discoloured bean, which is just slightly offish and yellowish, can come up with cereal, woody characteristics as a flavour. So again, negative and completely wasteful. And then more. I'm sorry, there are more. And this is only a brief consolidation of some of them. And I haven't even included pictures. Okay, I've just included words. We end up with ones such as spotted bean, which you rarely see, but if you do get a hold of it, it's pretty problematic in small volumes, in particular associated with medicinal type tastes. And all of these, a lot of them are linked to too high moisture, which is why we focus so much on importing coffee at particular moisture concentration and total moisture, but also high humidity as well. And infestation, I mean, it's not really something to laugh about when you end up with a load of weevils or berry borer doing damage in your coffee. But that is down to sanitation and also how we look after the coffee, not only in origin, but when it actually arrives in our own facilities. So briefly, just to start to wrap down, there has been extensive research done, in particular in Brazil and lately in Mexico as well, with particular types of off flavours and odours that are associated with coffees. Mouldy, earthy and oniony and Rio are the ones I've picked out, where they've basically isolated particular chemical compounds or precursors, which are usually fungal in nature or bacterial as well in nature, but that people have then associated with particular types of taste defects or off taints that are flavours and odours. So mouldiness, a lot of research has done there, has been associated with TCA 246, which you will see a lot on here, because that is associated not just with coffee as a problematic issue, but also associated with things such as wine corkage, mouldiness in general and other foods, and also earthiness, and also you can see on here as well as Rio, being in high concentrations. And the problem with TCA, which you might experience as iodine, medicinal or chemically, for example, as off taste and flavors, is that you only need a very low concentration for it to become problematic, which is why it's such an issue in isolation and with those particular types of defects. But I mean, no doubt, because you can talk about later, that there's a lot more work being done, in particular in coffee research, with being able to isolate what the particular precursors are, to be able to better describe and better associate how we're going to basically start to calibrate some of the defects. So finally then, coming back to us, we've got all of this information. They're visual, they're non-visual. Some of us have never experienced them. We struggle to describe them. When we do experience them, it's not always going to be a given that we actually describe them for what they are. Then how can we better navigate what we need to do as buyers and quality control for our end customers, for our consumers? What can we do to make ourselves better at this? I mean, it's not the first thing you want to be talking about, defects, but essentially when you're cupping, that's probably the first thing you're looking for. You're not looking for a problematic coffee that's going to cause you problems later on. So it comes back to us, perception thresholds. How good are we at perceiving problems in coffee in the first place when we're presented with a coffee to cup? If we already know it in isolation and we're presented it, then how low does it need to be for you, first of all, to say, look, I recognise it, it's there. What's your perception threshold? That is to do with testing, and I'm sure what you're discussing, how you can better do that in your own environments. The next stage is, as I've already really tried to strongly mention, is perceiving it as one thing, but then saying what you're associating it back to as another. So the descriptive language you're using to describe it. And finally, do you then associate it back to what the actual defect is? Which isn't the end outcome, but for things such as mould, the reason I keep on stressing on about mould, which I'm sure a few of you have had to deal with, but some of you might have done, is that why it's problematic is because there are clear aromas we associate with it and we experience, but we can't always visually see it, we can't always see the spores, but also it's something that can be within different lots that we have. So if we can pick it up at the beginning and we can say, look, this is what we're experiencing descriptively, and then, for example, say, this is what I think it is, then it warrants a lot more of a reject because you've got everything to support what you're saying. But fundamentally, I think it's also a good thing to be able to, in the end, calibrate yourself to and better understand. And then there's this, subjectivity. Ferments for different people can mean different things. Over-fermentation might be isolated as being over-fermented, but you don't necessarily descriptively believe that it is problematic to you. So we have a scale of it, and for some coffees, which all coffees are fermented to a point, for some buyer that's not going to be a problem, for somebody else it is going to be a problem. And we've got different language that we could potentially, or descriptors that we could associate with this. So it's one way of getting there by saying, yeah, overripe strawberries, great, not a problem for you, but a problem for me. But then we can all agree that when we go beyond and we're starting to get to overripe pineapple, rotten fruit, intense, overpowers, that's really a serious ferment issue. But as I should say, somebody who experiences the whole spectrum on here might say, regardless, it's a ferment, over-ferment, to be clear, therefore it's problematic and I don't want it. And that's what subjectivity really comes down to. What do you want and what type of coffees do you want and quality? So finally, just a roundup of this. Some are identifiable, some are visual, and they starkly stand out at us, and we can better calibrate to them if we want to pick out visual defects. But a lot of them are not, and that's why they're so problematic. And a lot of them pass through all of the current standards that we have in place at origin, and even into some of the better grades of coffee and the top grades of coffee. So they only become present in a brewed form, so that's how we experience them. Their damage is irreversible. You can't do anything about it once you get it. You can't change your roast really to diminish the risk of it. They're there, and you need to kind of deal with them. And at the end, it directly affects the cup quality. It might be different how we perceive it and how we describe it, but it does affect the cup quality, which is why defects are so problematic. And anything we can do to better understand them and what they do surely should be a good thing. Thank you.
Yes. That was much better than I had hoped, and I had high hopes for that. So thanks very much, Marianne. Great. We're going to have a quick break.